The parachute didn't look like history at first. It looked like a stubborn knot of canvas and silence in the bed of a sunburned pickup, an old olive-drab bundle cinched with dry-rotted webbing and a brass buckle scabbed with verdigrease. Morning heat was already lifting waves off the gravel lot behind Halden Auto, and the smell of hot dust and brake cleaner mingled with the faint sweetness of old oil. Maris Halden set a wrench down on the valve cover of a '98 Ranger and watched the customer, Mr. Cortland, a retiree with hands like cedar bark, tap the bundle with the toe of his boot. "Came with the barn," he said. "Auction lot. Don't want it. Thought you might turn it into seat covers or whatnot." Maris didn't smile. She rarely wasted the energy. She wiped her hands on a rag stained with 10 different trucks and hopped off the fender. The brass buckle winked like a tired eye. Up close, she caught a breath of something she'd never smelled in her shop. Canvas cured in another century, the ghost of mildew and sea air, and some shy trace of smoke. It made the hairs on her forearms rise as surely as a sudden breeze. "It's Army," Cortland added, unnecessarily. "Or was." "Parachute," Maris said, and before she could stop herself, her voice softened. "World War II, by the look." She didn't know why she knew, except that she'd grown up under the shadow of things built to last. Bridges, fieldstone farmhouses, the derelict airstrip just past the river like a finger pointing at the sky, and a father who never said what he felt. She had learned to read metal for what it really was. Canvas, too. The weave told you the decade. The hardware told you commerce and war had once been in love. Cortland shrugged. "You want it? If I take it, you'll let me charge you full for the timing chain." He grinned, surprised into youth. "You drive a hard bargain, Miss Halden." She almost corrected him. "It's just Maris." But names were for people she let in. Customers got the steel cable version of her, the one that didn't fray under load. She hoisted the bundle and felt more weight than cloth ought to have. Something was inside the parachute that wasn't supposed to be there. She carried it into the shop like an old secret. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow, I have a special story for you. The garage radio muttered an old Hank Williams through static. Dust motes leaned in the window light, interested. Maris cleared a rectangle of clean bench space with the edge of her forearm and laid the chute down. She worked the buckle gently, then with a persuasive twist that every seized fastener respected. The straps sighed open, canvas loosened. The bundle exhaled. The canopy unfurled like fog, panel after panel of olive and khaki brightening to an improbable bone color where the sun had never reached. Silk, not nylon. The lines, beige and tight, lay in Hank's pale violin strings humming with some music she hadn't learned yet. A stenciled marking near the crown read CANOPY, type T5, 28 feet, 1944. A depot stamp bled purple into the fabric. U.S. Army Air Forces, Natick. 80 years, she thought, and laid a palm flat on the silk. 80 summers. 80 winters. How many dawns like this, with light coming through the door at just that angle? Her own age felt a thin blade compared to numbers like that. She told herself to keep it practical. Appraise, clean, maybe sell to a museum. She told herself that, and then she didn't listen, because when she leaned in, she saw the hand. Not a hand's labor. Stitches inside the hem that weren't factory. A needle had moved here on a bad night. You could tell. The thread didn't match the military grade. It was slightly darker, maybe waxed with candle smoke. Someone had opened a seam and then closed it again. Neat enough to be quiet, imperfect enough to be human. "Okay," she whispered to the empty shop. "What did you hide?" A ratchet clicked twice on the Ranger as heat settled into the hood. Outside, a diesel rolled by, coughing. Maris found her kit of thread picks and curved needles, the ones she used for seat seams when customers wanted to save leather that had already decided to die. She slid the pick into the parachute's whisper and lifted a loop at a time, mindful of the way fabric could mourn if you rushed it.
The last stitch let go. She reached inside the hem with 2 fingers and touched metal. It was a tiny cylinder, cool and stubborn, the color of pewter in shade. She drew it out and saw that it was a pilot's pencil tube, slender, capped, the kind that clipped into flight jackets so notes could be taken in bad cold. This one had been repurposed. Wax had sealed the cap along the threads. A thin twine was tied around it in a double fisherman's knot and then stitched into the seam, a safety line for the secret. Maris cut the twine with a breath held and twisted at the wax. It gave with a little cry. Inside were paper and smell. The paper had that brittle softness of pages that had outlived most of their readers. It was rolled like a cigarette and stained tan at one end. The smell was pencil and damp cellar and a shadow of tobacco. She eased the roll out onto the bench and felt her hands, so sure around gaskets and rotors, go uncertain. A message. Of course it was a message. It could have been coordinates, or a warning, or a goodbye. It could have been all of them. The world sometimes put more than one thing on the same page and told you to live with it. She unrolled it. The paper flinched and then lay flat with help from 2 sockets she set on the corners. The handwriting was small and disciplined, the script of a man who had been taught to make letters march. It slanted slightly right, as if leaning toward whatever came next. If the person who finds this can read, thank you. If you can carry this to Willow Creek, to J.M., where the sycamores bend over the old mill race. Tell her that he jumped. Tell her that the ring is under the white stone. Tell her we tried to turn the wind. There was a pause in ink, a straight line where the pencil had hesitated and then committed. Forgive me. E.N. 82nd, June 5, 44. June 5th? She felt more than thought. That was the night before the troop drops in Normandy, D-Day -1. The message had been sealed in a seam, in a parachute that might have opened over black water or hedgerows that held their breath beneath men who were more boy than soldier. Maris touched the initials with her knuckle and felt heat rise under her skin as if the paper had its own heartbeat. She said the letters out loud. E.N. It could have been anyone. It could have been nobody. But the hairline crack in the head gasket of her life, her father's silence, the way the old airfield made her stomach fold over itself whenever she drove past, the photo on the mantel of a young face in a uniform nobody explained, widened. Air hissed through. A different engine within her began. She should have called Cortlandt and told him what she found, asked if he'd meant to give this up along with the barn junk. She should have called the county museum. She should have put the paper back and closed the seam and gone back to the ranger's timing chain and the 23 other reasons her rent got paid. Instead, Maris looked at the words Willow Creek and felt the map inside her body draw a line of its own. There was a Willow Creek in their county, the creek itself, and a village no bigger than the callus at the base of her thumb. The old mill race was a rumor when her grandmother was young. The sycamores, though, everyone knew the sycamores. Bones of the valley. There was a white stone under them that kids dared each other to lift. J.M. She didn't let herself think about who that might be. Names had gravities. Names bent light. Maris slid the paper back into the tube and wrapped it in a shop rag as if it could bruise. She retied the twine with the same knot the note's author had used. It felt like a handshake across years. She placed the tube in her pocket where her thigh would remember it. Then she bundled the canopy with gentleness that surprised her and tucked it into the corner of the office where she kept the few things she didn't understand yet. Old carburetors with artistry in their throat, a brass toolbox with a dent like a story, a wooden plane that had belonged to a man her father called the old man, never my father. The ranger waited for her. Work waited. Maris pushed the parachute to the edge of her mind and forced her hands back into the day's mechanics. It's a puzzle, she told herself. Nothing more. A puzzle with a map stapled at the bottom.
By noon, the chain was tensioned and the new water pump hummed like a second chance. Cortland paid in cash, peered at the bundle in her office corner, and didn't ask. He'd been young enough once to know where younger people kept the things that mattered. "Listen," he said, hand on the door. "They're rebuilding the east span of the river bridge next week. If you're going anywhere out to Willow Country, do it before the detours make sinners out of saints." Maris did not believe in omens, but when she closed the shop at 5, lights snapped off, bay doors drawn down like eyelids, and radio murmuring itself to sleep, she found herself putting the parachute on the passenger seat of her old blue Cherokee and a thermos of coffee in the cup holder. She changed her shirt, clean, no shop logo, and brushed the worst of the grease from her nails. The notes tube settled into the pocket of her jacket as if it had been weighted for that purpose from the beginning. The Creek Country Road had the kind of long curves that made old songs sound true. Past the decommissioned depot, brick, boarded windows, the watchtower like a broken finger, then into the low hill folds where cows grazed with the patience of saints. The Cherokee droned. The day laid itself down into the long grass of evening. Maris felt the quiet fill in around her and, for once, didn't flinch. She let the line of ink in the note pull her steady. The village was a cluster of porches and mailboxes, a post office that shut early, and a mill whose ruin had been turned into a park, with a sign that tried not to look apologetic. Sycamores leaned over the run of water like big old men at a fence, arms crossed, gossiping. Their bark peeled in parchment scrolls, white puzzle pieces, her father used to call them. "Bones trees," she'd said once, and he had made a sound in his throat she thought was disagreement, until she understood it was grief. She parked under a sign that promised "fish at your own risk." The water slipped past with the voice of a tired woman telling a long story. Families had left, and the benches along the path held heat and the day's crumbs of picnics. Across the mill race, a white stone waited like a grin. J.M., she thought. J.M. The oldest house on the lane above the park had blue shutters and a porch swing that remembered everything. A small placard beside the steps read, "Willow Keep," the kind of name people gave a house when the house had kept them. Maris stood at the foot of the steps and felt suddenly aware of her boots and the oil she never quite got out of her hair. She could put the tube under the stone and leave. She could break the seal she'd put back in place and read the rest of the message herself. She could set fire to it all, roll the ashes thin between her fingers, and be a person whose days were no larger than a shop, an office, a quiet apartment with a ficus that complained. She could be her father's daughter that way. Capable, contained, finished at the edges. Or she could knock. The woman who opened the door did not look like a set of initials. She looked like a life. Late 80s maybe if she had been brave enough to count them. White hair in a braid curled into a bun to keep it from the wind's ideas. Eyes like the inside of a jar where somebody had stored a summer sky. She took in Maris's boots, the grease ghosting her cuticles, and the weight in her pocket that bent her stance. "Can I help you?" she asked, voice clear as water over stones. "I hope so," Maris said. The words made a tight turn in her throat. She touched the tube and watched the older woman's eyes flick there and land. "In a parachute." She didn't mean to say more, but the woman's hand went to the doorframe as if something had moved under her feet, and a name came out of her mouth like a bell rung once and still ringing. "Elias." Maris felt the syllables in the floorboards. "E-N," she said softly. And then, because the older woman had earned it simply by standing in that doorway with grace instead of trembling, "J.M.?" The woman's mouth found a smile that wasn't a performance. "June Merriweather," she said, "and you'd better come in." Inside smelled like beeswax and paper. Books had colonized every surface that wouldn't mind. A kettle was already humming. June set it to a stricter boil as if this were a drill they'd run before. On the mantel, a photograph. A young man in a jump jacket, cap set wrong on purpose,
a grin that knew too much and forgave anyway. E.N. Elias North, the frame said along one edge in an old label maker's stubborn font. June poured tea, not because tea solved anything, but because it gave hands a reason to keep going when hearts hesitated. "Tell me how it came to you," she said. Merritt told the story the way she did when she explained a diagnosis to a customer. Everything in its sequence, nothing added, nothing left out. She didn't know she was capable of that about anything that wasn't an engine. The kettle rattled like a breath that had just remembered it belonged to a body. June listened without interrupting and without pretending. When Merritt said the words white stone, June closed her eyes for the length of a decade. When Merritt said tomorrow they're rebuilding the bridge, June made a small noise like somebody who has already planned for something and isn't going to confess it. "And the message," June said finally. "May I?" Merritt slid the tube from her pocket and watched June's hands, veined, capable, twist the cap as if they'd never forgotten how. The paper came out with a reluctant hiss. June smoothed it under a thin book with a spine worn to suede. She read with her mouth, not her voice. Her lips shaped the words while her throat kept the rest. Then she shook her head in the way of old women who would rather break than bend to something wrong. She looked up. "He did jump," she said. The air in the room felt like a parachute opening, a tug, then a bloom. Merritt didn't know she'd been holding on to the word forgive in the note until it dissolved on her tongue, sweet and bitter in the same breath. "When I was 19, June said, still not touching the photo on the mantel the way some people couldn't say a certain name twice in an afternoon, "I waited at this window for the mailman like a lighthouse waits for night. Elias used to say he'd bring me back a piece of the channel so I'd believe water could look that hard and still be your friend. Then it was June, and there were rumblings, and on the 5th, well, she touched the edge of the paper the way you'd let your finger trail in a creek. For a while, they told me he deserted. Some clerk wrote a wrong line in a ledger, or a sergeant with a grudge needed someone to blame. I kept his letter in a place I can't get to anymore at my age, thinking when I felt strong enough I'd set the record right. But there's a bad geometry to grief. It makes simple things hard, and hard things simple. I never finished." She didn't look ashamed. She looked like someone who had walked very far carrying something she had promised not to put down. "Deserted?" Merritt heard her voice go flint. She tapped the silk with the back of a nail. "This is a thing you do when every door between you and death is locked except one." June's smile this time was tired and honorable. "You speak like a mechanic about a parachute, which is to say, correctly." They both laughed, quiet and exact, like people testing an old hinge. "Under the white stone," Merritt said into the place their laughter made. "Should we—" June was already putting on a sweater. She said, "If I've learned anything by 87, it's that you don't let the afternoon get the better of a question."
They walked the short block together, step for step, young and old at the same pace for once. The mill race laid its shoulder to the work it had done since the day a hare thought of a river. The sycamores lifted their peeled arms and let the sky see its bones. The white stone at the edge of the water looked bigger up close. Every kid in 3 counties had dared every other kid to lift it. They'd all failed when they went alone. "We'll do it on 3, June said. "But truthfully, I'll probably pull on 1 out of sheer excitement." They bent in tandem and made their grab before their knees could argue. The stone rolled a reluctant foot and tried to pretend it weighed more than it did. Under it lay a pocket of earth and a small tin box with a hinged lid, the kind that had come with cigarettes when you could buy a habit as easily as a lemon drop. June held it like a robin's egg. Her thumb pressed at the rust on one corner and found it kept its promises. The lid lifted with a sound the afternoon agreed to remember. Inside, a ring wrapped in waxed paper, a field gray ribbon folded to a strip, a dog tag, and a second note, this one folded to the sharpness of an order. The name on the tag was Elias North. The ring was plain and warm with someone else's heat. The ribbon said only airborne in ghost letters the silk had taught to survive sunlight.
Maris felt June's hand find hers without having to ask where it was. June unfolded the second note and brought it closer to her eyes, not with impatience, but with reverence. J. If the wind does what it's told, this will be under our stone by noon. If it doesn't, then I have admired you for being the kind of woman who'd forgive a river. I have been told not to write names, not to write dates. I have not been told not to write truth. There is a boy in my platoon, Halden, who hums like a kettle when he is scared. He is from a town with a bridge like ours. If I do not bring him home, find him. Tell him the stories we told each other in the dark. Tell him the difference between coward and careful. Tell him I know the sound a parachute makes before it knows it's opened. Tell him to name his daughter what you would have named ours. E. Maris read the paragraph 3 times before she realized she was the only one still breathing. The name in the ink didn't share her father's first name, but it shared his last, and it had set its boot firmly on the trail of their family. Halden. Kettle hum when scared. Bridge like ours. Town like this. She had known for years that her father's silence had weight. She felt it when she hugged him and his back didn't give. She had suspected for months that the old photo on the mantel had something to confess. The nameless jawline under a parade cap had the same stubborn as her own. But she had never considered that the road from a parachute and a white stone would run right through the name that had bought her shop, had paid her rent, had fit her like a glove she sometimes hated. Halden. June squeezed her fingers until it was almost pain. He writes like he's apologizing to the paper, she said. Your father's people, are they from the Ridge country? Maris could hear the Cherokee ticking as it cooled in the parking lot. She could hear the river giving its old counsel to rocks that didn't ask for it. She could hear her heartbeat in a place beneath all that, down where engines do their jobs without you congratulating them. Bastian Halden, she said, and the name came out steady. My father. He never talked about his father, said the old man as if the man were a barn with a leak, not a person. June's eyes blinked slowly, the way a person looks when an old photograph has just moved. Then this is your road as much as mine. They stood there with the tin and its stubborn smallness while shadows lengthened across the grass like a measure of time you could trip over if you weren't careful. Children ran past, laughing. A dog dragged a man toward smells that had made promises all afternoon. The day prepared to close like a book that loved to be read even when it had earned sleep. What now? Maris asked, because she understood machines and problems and torque values. She did not understand this. June rewrapped the ring. She set the dog tag back the way she'd found it, as if kindness meant returning things to their original astonishment. We write down what the clerk got wrong, she said. We call the county office and make them pretend their phones work after hours. We call the National Archives and stand in a line they put people like us in for sport. We do the patient things. And the impatient ones? Maris asked.
We go to the depot, June said, without looking at it, though its brick shoulders loomed above the trees as if secrets gave it posture. They kept records, or they burned them. Either way, somebody knows whether Elias was put down in ink for a thing he didn't do. Maris nodded, because her body knew how to agree before her mind decided what agreement would cost. Tomorrow, she said, before they close the bridge. June took her hand again briefly, like punctuation. Tonight, she said, smiling, you eat, and you sleep, and you dream as if the dead are your witnesses. They replaced the tin as if returning a bird to its nest. The white stone rolled back with the grouchy dignity of a monarch being reseated. Back at Willowkeep, June found a small box in a drawer and set the tube inside with the patience of a long letter. She touched the photograph on the mantel for the first time since Maris had arrived, not with apology, but with a touch that said, I've gone as far as I could alone. Now help comes in boots and grease under the nails. Stay for pie,
she said, and it wasn't an invitation so much as a way to keep the world from breaking while they were looking at it. Maris stayed. June's kitchen had learned the recipe for solace a long time ago. Butter that remembered cows, sugar that remembered Cain, flour that remembered hands. They ate at the small table under the window while the day did its old trick of turning to night right in front of you as if laying down paint. June asked about the shop. Maris admitted that she loved engines because most of them told the truth, and when they lied, she could hear it. June asked about family. Maris admitted that her mother had left when she was still small enough to sit on the counter and watch her father teach the world a lesson by refusing to be taught one in return. After pie, June found a shoebox labeled Airfield in a sideways hand. Inside were photographs that had lost their names and dates, but not their faces. Men in uniforms looking like boys pretending to be the kind of men their fathers were. Airplanes in black and white, all teeth and wing. A woman in a dress that had remembered summer too well to be practical. "Here," June said, and passed an image across to Maris, an early 40s snapshot of a line of paratroopers waiting with straps in their hands and jokes in their mouths they couldn't say out loud. Third from the left, a man whose jaw made every compromise look expensive. He had a dimple nobody would have dared put in the official portrait. In his left hand, a field pencil, the same kind of tube that now sat wrapped in a rag in June's box. Maris didn't know she was leaning until her shoulder bumped the table and moved the sugar bowl. "Elias," she said. June's eyes softened with gratitude you couldn't trivialize by calling it tears. "Elias," she said back. They set a time, 9, at the depot. June said she'd bring a thermos. Maris said she'd bring a crowbar. It wasn't a joke. On the drive home, the Cherokee's headlights painted the road new again. The decommissioned depot kept its black windows and its reputation for making people feel watched. Maris glanced at it and felt the parachute's note like a coin on her tongue. "A boy in my platoon, Halden, hum like a kettle when scared. Tell him to name his daughter what you would have named ours." She pulled into her apartment's cracked lot with the kind of care you gave, not to asphalt, but to the person you were going to be when you put the car in park. She carried the parachute upstairs because the thought of leaving it alone in the night was like leaving a dog tied to a tree in a thunderstorm. She spread it across the couch and the rug and the coffee table and sat cross-legged on the floor among the panels like someone who had been invited to a country not on any map. Sleep came late and unceremonial. She dreamed not of falling, but of opening, of the sound silk makes when it lifts to meet air that wants to hold it. She woke at 4 to the railroad loneliness only small towns know and didn't fight it. At 6, she wrapped the tube and the dog tag and the ring in a scarf and put them in an old cigar tin with a lid that clicked exactly the way it had when it belonged to a man who had taken his lunches at a counter that knew his order without asking. She arrived at the depot early enough to feel foolish. Dew still made the grass pick a fight with her jeans. The brick, up close, held warmth like a secret it wouldn't let you touch. A sign on the chain link read, "Federal property, no trespassing," which in this county means, please be careful not to get caught. June's sedan pulled in with the therapy of turn signal clicking. She climbed out with a cane she didn't need so much as respect. She had brought a thermos and a folder with letters in it. Maris had brought a crowbar and the skill of someone who could hear a lock's manners by how it refused. "Ready?" June asked.
"I don't know," Maris said, "but I'm going to be." They found a gate that had learned to give in exchange for being asked the right way. Inside, the depot smelled like wet paper and swear words nobody would repeat now that their owners were gone. Bulletin boards held orders whose staples had rusted through and were now held only by the faith that instructions didn't dissolve when people did. Maris's flashlight made a simple promise along the hall. Records weren't filed where signs said they were. They were filed where a clerk had put them on the day his lunch was better than his concentration. Maris found a door whose lock had performed its duty longer than any of the men who'd used it, and made a small apology with the thin end of her bar.
It sighed like the edge of a storm giving up. Inside, a room of cabinets. Inside the cabinets, drawers. Inside the drawers, the lives of men in carbon copies. June set the thermos on a file box and unsnapped it like a blessing. Steam, good and strong, rose into the dust and made an argument for civilization. Maris pulled a drawer labeled Jump Logs, Outbound, 1944. She scanned columns, the way she scanned diagnostics on an OBD2 reader, fast and accurate and without pride. Then she pulled a second drawer, Incident Reports, European Theater. The paper was delicate as the wing of a white moth. She found EN with a pencil that had not learned to be wrong yet. She found Howden B, 2 instances. One in a training roster at a camp she couldn't place, one in an incident report written in a temper that filled the words with someone's private weather. June read over her shoulder while the depot breathed old breath. Bastian Haldon? She asked softly. B. Maris's mouth went dry. Could be anyone. June's hand steadied on her shoulder. Could be what it is. The incident report, rendered in the clipped diction of men who had been told never to attach adjectives to facts, said only this: Private B. Haldon, MIA. Account contradicted by Corporal N.H. Hale. Desertion suspected. Provisional. Suspected, June said. Provisional. She tapped the words like they might confess. That clerk liked to leave doors open so other people would close them. Maris wanted to find the clerk and give him a job sweeping her shop where nobody could see him. Look, June said. Her finger hovered over an addendum in lighter pencil. See Appendix. Message confiscated. Operation Fireseed. Operation Fireseed. Maris rolled the name around as if it had flavor. You ever heard of that? June's mouth pressed into a line that, on a younger person, would have been stubborn. On her, it was knowledge being careful. No. Another drawer. Another room. A desk that had learned the weight of elbows. Maris opened boxes like she opened stubborn housings, with respect and a short list of curses saved for the right moment. They found a folder with half a tab. They found a page that expected to be more important than it had become. Maris read it and felt her jaw do what it did when rust refused to accept modern conveniences. Set. June put her hand on the table the way she'd put it on the white stone. The appendix said, confiscated envelope from personal effects, field note in pencil, reference to ring transmission, mentions boy Haldon, cord, mill race, white stone, message to JM, translated to clear, sealed. Under that, in a different hand, more hurried, pencil tube not recovered at the time of inventory, presumed lost/destroyed, do not contact civilian. June's breath was a long road. They knew. They knew about me, about the stone, about the ring. Maris put both palms on the desk and pressed until wood explained itself. And they chose to keep the file breathing while the people in it drowned. A sound at the far end of the hall made both their shoulders remember decades. Not a mouse, not a building settling around its old regret. Footsteps. 2 sets, purposeful. The light through the door went different, like a person had stood in it and made it think of shade. Maris closed the file on instinct and slid it into her jacket with the same economy that returned a torque wrench to its drawer without looking. June met her eyes, and in that look they became conspirators, the way strangers sometimes do when the right-wrong thing happens. The footsteps stopped outside the records room. A knuckle rapped on the door jamb once, twice, like someone tapping a bar to quiet a room that didn't want to hear what came next. Miss Haldon, June Merriweather, we're with Army Historical. We've been trying to reach you since yesterday. We believe you're in possession of artifacts related to an operation codenamed Fireseed. We need to speak with you.
Now. Maris felt the old parachute in her memory lift in a different wind. June's hand found hers again and held on, not like punctuation this time, but like a new sentence that knew its verb and wasn't afraid of it. The man's shadow tilted in the doorway. A second shadow leaned beside it, less patient. "Please," the first voice said, paper smooth, "this is sensitive material. For your safety and the integrity of the record, hand over the tube and any notes you may have recovered. We'll make sure things go where they belong." Maris looked at June, looked at the folder against her ribs, felt the dog tag in the tin in her bag press its name into her. Elias North, Halden, Whitestone, forgive me. Tell him to name his daughter what you would have named ours. She took a breath that felt like stepping out of a plane into night. "Gentlemen," she said, and the word had edges, "before we do anything with our hands, tell us what fireseed is. Tell us why a clerk wrote, 'Do not contact civilian,' about a woman who waited at a window for news that never came. Tell us why my father's name is in a file that calls him missing and then suspects him for being the kind of scared that sings." Silence answered for a second that had made itself useful in other rooms. Then the second voice, the impatient shadow, cut in, less careful. "Ma'am, you don't understand. If you've opened anything, you could have compromised an ongoing—" "Ongoing," June said softly, and the softness was a storm that knew where it was going. "Darling, the only thing that's ongoing here is dignity." Boots shifted. A hand rested on a hip like the beginning of an argument. Paper rustled, not because paper had something to say, but because men who carry paper believe it takes their side simply by being near them. The first voice came back smoother. "Please, we don't want to escalate." Maris felt the word escalate like a wrench slipping off a bolt and taking skin with it. She tightened her grip on June's fingers. In her pocket, the pencil tube was warm, as if years could make their own heat when they finally caught someone's attention. She thought of the parachute opening, how there's a second where all you have is the sound, no assurance, only an agreement with air you hope keeps itself. She thought of Elias writing with a field pencil while engines roared and water below took attendance without mercy. She thought of her father humming when thunderstorms put a roof on his voice. She stepped forward until her boots shadowed the doorway and let the men see exactly how much of her day she had left to give to anybody who forgot what a promise cost. "Tell us the truth," she said. Behind the men, out in the hall, a door farther down banged open. Another set of steps. A third shadow, the color of urgency, slid along the floor toward them. A woman's voice, this time, breathless and unbureaucratic. "Maris Halden, don't hand them anything. They're not Army historical. They're contract." The first man turned, slow. The second man cursed under his breath. June's hand, in Maris's, became a signal flag. "Who are you?" Maris asked the hallway, her own voice steady because everything else in her wasn't. "I'm the one who's been chasing fireseed since my grandfather stopped talking," the woman said, and stepped into view with a badge that had a seal on it but no shape Maris recognized. "You found the wrong secret in the right place, and you're about to be asked to give up the only piece that proves what they buried." The man in the doorway took a breath, as if he owned the air and the rights to distribute it. "Ma'am, don't make this difficult." Maris let go of June's hand with a squeeze that said everything words were going to take too long to say. Then she reached into her jacket for the pencil tube, and, with the patience of someone who understood that torque has a direction for a reason, turned the cap just enough to smell pencil and old tobacco and the weather of a night that had waited 80 years for this. The man took a step. The woman with the badge took another. June lifted her chin like a lighthouse. Outside, the first train of the day woke the tracks. Inside, the file in Maris's jacket whispered when she moved. "Choose, now," the impatient man said. Maris looked down at the tube in her hand
and knew that whatever she chose here would not be a simple difference between keep and give, but the kind that divided a life into before and after. She closed her fingers, lifted her eyes, and answered.
This story took us a long time. If you like it, subscribe. Now, back to the story. I'm not handing it over. Maris didn't raise her voice. She simply let it sit level in the doorway the men filled, as serviceable and unafraid as a wrench laid across a rattling engine. One of them, square shoulders, haircut with instructions, shifted his weight like a person who had learned arguments at a school where chairs didn't squeak. The other, a little too eager, eyes that ran ahead of his mouth, put a palm on his belt as if that would make his posture persuasive. "Miss Halden," the careful one said, "that item is federal property connected to a classified operation codenamed Fireseed." Maris felt the pencil tube warm in her hand, as if metal could take sides. "Then classify a conversation," she said. "What was Fireseed?" "Above your," the eager one began. "Pay grade." He was going to say pay grade. "Dear heart, you don't get to say that to a woman holding the part of history you've lost." A third presence slid into the room's light. The woman with the unfamiliar badge had kept her breath, but not her patience. She stepped where both men had to make room or look foolish. "Leila Cortez," she said, flashing the seal, and now Maris caught the letters OIG in the fine print. "Archives Inspector General's office. I've got 2 subpoenas and an email from a terrified curator who says the depot has been visited 3 times this month with men with lanyards but no work orders. You two can show me your authorizations, or you can take a walk while the grown-ups talk." The careful man didn't blink. "Ma'am, we're contractors operating under a DoD archival remediation agreement." "Translation," Leila said without gratitude, "they have a badge they can print at Kinko's and a mandate to clean up messes that embarrass old paper." She moved so she half-blocked June with her body. "Miss Merriweather, I think you waited long enough for people with the wrong badges to make you small. Miss Halden, if that tube contains what you say, it's your leverage and our proof. Don't let anyone separate you from it." The eager man tried a smile. "Let's not get adversarial. I'm adversarial with entropy. The rest of you I merely out-organize." June's hand found Maris's again and squeezed once, hard. It was a vote and a vow. "Tell me what Fireseed is," Maris said, because she believed in the way a question, properly torqued, could loosen a corroded truth. Leila nodded once, as if checking a gauge she trusted. "Late 1943 through mid-1944, OSS Pilot Project. Field operatives compiled seeds, tiny packets of personal proof and instruction, to be hidden in soldiers' gear. If a paratrooper didn't make it home, the seed was designed to sprout where it could do the most good, at a mill race, under a white stone, behind a church step, using civilian networks to correct the record, transfer tokens, deliver messages, a moral countermeasure to military error." June made a sound like a teacup meeting its saucer. "We were a moral countermeasure once." Then a liaison officer screwed up. He flagged Fireseed as a leak risk. Some desk colonel got nervous about unvetted communications to civilians. They froze the program. They collected what they could. They lost what they didn't understand. The careful man shifted his jaw. "Speculation." "Appendix," Maris said, and her voice had edges. "Confiscated envelope, message translated. Do not contact civilian." The careful man took a small breath, preparing the kind of sentence that begins with, "unfortunately." She cut it in half with a look. "Here's what's going to happen.
Miss Halden and Miss Merriweather will accompany me to a neutral office. County library is fine. We will scan and catalog the contents of the tube with chain of custody signatures. You two will step back and call your supervisor, and if he wants a fight with the archives over provenance, he can spell subpoena correctly on the first try. The eager man's hand twitched near his belt again and found nothing useful there. The careful man measured the risk and decided to be patient. "You'll be hearing from us," he said.
I like letters, June replied sweetly. They arrive in envelopes and ask permission to come in. The men withdrew, pleased with how little they'd retreated. Their footfalls ghosted down the hall with the suggestion that sound itself wore boots. Leela waited until silence admitted it was alone with them. Then she exhaled like a person who had held her breath for a decade and a half. "Thank you," Maris said, because gratitude, like oil, did more good when applied promptly. Leela shrugged into a smile that hadn't forgotten how to be tired. "My grandfather stopped talking about 44 the night he taught me how to wind a clock," she said. "He stopped talking, so I started reading. If Fireseed had worked the way the field wanted, there'd be less ink where grief should have gone." June touched the tube with a fingertip. "Let's put ink in the right place." They left the depot through a side door, learning to be a door again. Leela locked up with a bar that had made peace with rust. Outside, morning had committed to itself. The world smelled like cut weeds and arguments postponed until after church. At the county library, they took over a conference room with a laminate table pretending to be walnut. The librarian, who knew June from author talks and knew Maris from the time she'd fixed an alternator in the parking lot during a downpour, brought them a sign that said "Reserved" and a carafe whose coffee would never be famous but would never fail a friend. Leela laid out evidence paper as if setting a table for someone who'd been hungry since before you were born. Maris turned the cap on the tube just as far as respect required and slid the note free. Under glass and scanner light, Elias's pencil strokes looked domestic and brave at once. Letters written by a hand that would have built a cradle if given the chance, and instead had been asked to strap on a parachute in the dark. They scanned the dog tag, the ribbon, the second note from the tin. They photographed the tin's hinges as if a history could be proven by the way metal learned to open and close for the right reasons. "Okay," Leela said, when all three women had initialed and dated until the present felt officially invited. "Next step is corrections. The Army Review Board's agency can change a service record. It takes time and stubbornness. We have both. But the faster route, the one that changes how people say his name in this county, is your father." "My father," Maris repeated, as if the word were a casing she had to inspect for hairline fatigue. "He calls his father the old man, like a broken barn. If the boy Halden in the note was my grandfather, then my father grew up in the echo of a secret that never finished saying itself. Go to him. Bring the paper, bring the ring, bring your voice. You have his face. If you're careful and brave, he'll borrow your courage like glasses." Maris looked at the clock on the conference room wall. 10:42, a time that believed in late mornings and second chances. She felt the soft weight of the tube in her palm and the harder weight of choices in her chest. "I need to be the one to tell him," she said. Leela packed their proofs into 2 folders, the originals in one, copies in the other, and handed the originals to Maris. "I'll file the petition with review boards. I'll start the paper fight. You start the human one." "Will you come?" June asked Leela, already reading the day's weather for courage. Leela shook her head. "Some roads ask for family only. I'll stay near my phone and a printer that still thinks it's 1999. June smiled with a warrior's courtesy. "Then we'll call you when men try to act taller than their shoes." They drove to the ridge without music. The hills wore their late summer fatigue like a jersey left out on the line.
Maris kept her hands at 10 and 2 as if posture could keep a heart from trying to climb out of a throat. Leela watched the road the way elders do when they're praying without telling you. Bastian Halden's house sat where it had always sat, on a little knob that had once been good for apple trees and now was good for satellite dishes. The porch steps knew his weight by heart. The screen door made the sound it made when she was 5 and tried to prove she could open it without using both hands. He opened the main door before she could knock. He always could tell when a motor came up the lane he had paid for in winter with his shoulders. "Maris," he said, which was both her name and his way of admitting he'd been listening for her. Up close, she could see the new tremor in his right hand, the one he denied when she asked and blamed on coffee when she didn't. His eyes did their old trick, blue when it rained, flint when it didn't, a kindness like weather between them. "This is June Merriweather," Maris said, and watched recognition crease his face into something like history remembering itself. "Ma'am," he said, and June nodded like two ships who had passed in fog and now understood they had been headed to the same harbor all along. "Dad," Maris said, and the word had to climb a hill to get out. "I found a parachute." He stepped back without thinking, as if moving would keep the floor from telling secrets. He let them in. The living room smelled like pine cleaner and a person trying not to be lonely. On the mantel, the same photograph of the jawline she recognized in her own mirror. The same habit of dust that avoided the picture as if guilt had a decent respect for the dead. She took the pencil tube from her pocket and set it on the coffee table. She didn't touch it again. She let it sit with its own gravitas. "What's that?" he said, not as a question, but as a test of whether words could behave themselves. "Something that belonged to a man named Elias North. He wrote your father's name in it. He wrote about the mill race and the white stone." Bastian's jaw found an old grief and put it on like a coat that still fit better than you wanted. He sat, because kneeling in front of the past felt too intimate. Maris untwisted the cap. She laid the first note on the table and sat across from her father so he had to read through the fact of her. She watched his eyes track the words, left to right, the way men who built things read. Letters into instructions, instructions into action. When he reached "Forgive me," he blinked. When he reached "Halden, who hums like a kettle when scared," his right hand stopped its tremble as if a metronome had been told to rest. When he reached the last line, "Tell him to name his daughter what you would have named ours," he made a small sound that had no word assigned to it in any language he respected. He didn't cry. He had built his life around the discipline of not crying, but his face learned a new posture. "Dad," Maris said, and the word was a wire that could carry what it needed if she kept her hand steady. "He wrote about your father." He nodded once, the way a man gives permission to truth when it's going to say what it wants anyway. "My father didn't come back right. Years later he died, not old enough and not young enough, and nobody wrote a letter anybody could read. He called 44 that summer, like a weather that made winters." By 3, Maris's signature looked like a path you could follow even in rain. Leela scanned, sent, called, confirmed, left voicemails in languages bureaucracy recognizes. "Now what?" Bastian asked, because men who fix things are suspicious of quiet. "Now we tell the county before the country," June said steady. "They set their mouths on what the world is by what gets said at the Grange Hall. I know a man with a lectern who owes me a favor he should have paid in 1969. They booked the community center for Saturday afternoon. Leela printed posters that looked like wedding announcements for Truth. June made a list of names to call in ink, not because phones remembered better if you used a pen, but because she did. Friday night, Maris spread the parachute across her apartment again. This time it didn't feel like an intrusion. It felt like a guest who had hung a coat on a chair and accepted coffee. She slept in the silk shadow and dreamed of letters leaning slightly right. Saturday came with humidity and the polite resentment of folding chairs. The community center smelled like floor wax and potluck ambition. People came because June had told them to, and because their grandfathers had taught them that when an elderly woman asks you to sit still while she makes a county better, you do. June spoke first, briefly, beautifully, about waiting and about proof. Leela spoke next, precisely, mercilessly, about fireseed and clerks and the lies paper tells when no one brings it witnesses. Then Maris spoke, which she had not planned to like, and said the name Elias North as if it were a tool she had learned to use safely. Bastian read the note aloud. His voice had defined itself twice, once at Forgive Me and once at Halden. When he reached Name his daughter, he looked at Maris and did not try to hide that his eyes had water in them. After, there were questions the way rain follows heat. Some wondered why government had to use fancy words for decent ideas. Some asked if the parachute would be donated to the museum once they had one again. Some asked June what color the sycamores looked like on the day before Good News. She told them, same as always, good news teaches you how to see. A man in his 90s stood up without help and used his Marine Corps cane like punctuation. He said, I knew North, and silence laid itself down like a blessing. He played cribbage with a face that didn't understand losing. He once gave me his last lucky strike and told me to quit 2 days later. He was the sort of young men old men think they invented. He nodded to June. You waited good. She bowed her head as if accepting a medal you can't polish. After the meeting, the two contractors entered like weather that had chosen to be inconvenient. They kept their hands visible and their mouths cautious. Leela met them halfway with a folder that had eaten better than they had. Here are your copies: chain of custody, petition receipts, sheriff's memo. If you wish to challenge custody, file in Judge Odell's court on Monday and bring enough lunch for disappointment. The careful one took the papers. The eager one glanced around the room and saw a county that had already decided what it believed. He stood down without much theater. What is fireseed to you? Maris asked him before he could leave. She wasn't sure why she asked, except that questions sometimes let people put down what they were carrying. He looked younger without his posture. A contract, he said, and my grandfather's name on a manifest we never found. Then sit down, June said, not unkindly. You can listen while we learn the long version. He did. Letters started to come in the way rain does when it decides a roof is not an argument but a drum. A woman in Vermont wrote that her grandmother had a ribbon and a note in a flower tin. A man in Texas wrote that his attic held a bundle of silk he thought was some uncle's bad taste in curtains. Leela turned her kitchen into a map. The country lit up in pins like a constellation that had been waiting for someone to notice it wasn't random. In October, the Army Review Board's agency sent a letter thicker than shame. It said the words a county had needed to put one name down right. Service in good standing. No desertion. Posthumous commendation recommended. June read the letter on her porch with the care of a person folding a flag. She didn't cry. She put on a dress the color of a robin's egg and asked the mirror whether 87 was too old to behave as if the future had noticed her. The mirror said the same thing it had said the day she decided to keep the house and the habit of hope. No. They held the ceremony at the old airfield because grief sometimes likes to be corrected where it began. The decommissioned depot cleaned up reluctantly, then with pride. The parachute hung from the rafters like a lung learning to breathe the right way. A bugle tried and failed to be perfect, which made it better. A colonel who had practiced his humility in a mirror handed June a cold bronze star in a warm handshake and said words that blessed the dead and flattered the living. Leela stood behind them like a person who had stolen something from time and given it back to the right owner. Bastian pinned the ribbon on the photo of Elias with fingers that learned precision making a living. He was careful not to touch the glass where Elias's grin lived. Then he turned to his daughter, who had grease under her nails and truth in her pocket, and put the dog tag in her palm. "It's for your shop," he said. So you remember the difference between repair and restoration. Repair makes a thing run. Restoration makes it deserve to. Then after the crowd wandered toward deviled eggs and stories with more color than credibility, June and Maris walked to the edge of the runway where grass had been allowed to vote. The wind came level and generous across the field. "You changed my life," Maris said, "because sometimes the truest thing you can say feels like it should have been obvious to both of you already." June shook her head. "Elias did," she said. "He wrote a good sentence and put it where the world could eventually find it. You delivered it. That's the work. Delivering on what the dead hoped we'd still do." "What will you do now?" Maris asked. "I will keep my porch lit," June said. "And when young people in love walk past, I'll tell them the water can be both a road and a mirror." She smiled toward the sycamores the way you smile toward someone who has kept a promise long enough to count. "And I'll write letters for people who never got one." Maris looked back at the hangar where the parachute watched like a cloud given a job. "I'm going to change my sign," she said. "Holden Auto still fixes brakes, but I'm going to add a word." June raised an eyebrow that had recommended good ideas to better people. "Which one?" "Restorations. For machines, for names, for anything that can be made to deserve its own story." They stood quietly long enough to learn the sound the wind makes when it moves through silk.
Winter stepped up to the edge of town and decided not to be mean about it. The contractors sent a polite apology through their company's counsel and a box of scans that belonged to other families. Lila took a job that paid less and did more at the archives because sometimes winning makes you greedy for a different metric. Sheriff Harlan returned a library book a day late and paid his fine with the good humor of a man who had decided law was worth more than convenience. The county council voted to turn the depot into a museum and a place where teenagers could do homework without pretending they weren't crying. Bastian came by the shop on Thursdays with donuts and the names of obscure parts he remembered wrong. He talked more about the old man, about the hum a kettle makes when a storm sits close to the roof, about the day he saw his daughter carry something heavy into a room and ask other people to lift with her. One evening, Maris closed the bay doors early and spread the parachute out one last time on the clean shop floor. She knelt at the seam where her fingers had learned a stranger stitch. She threaded a needle with waxed linen like the old thread and closed the hem with tiny, forgiving work. When she finished, she pressed her palm to the silk. "Thank you," she said into the fabric. She hoped it carried, the way sound sometimes does, past facts, into a place where a boy with a grin and a woman with a porch could still make plans. In spring, a girl from the high school brought her grandfather to the museum. He touched the silk with the back of his finger and made the same small sound Bastian had made at Name His Daughter. He told the docent, Maris, on her day off, about a field near Carantine where the night smelled like apples and smoke and the sky did not bother to be polite. He said he'd seen a chute drift past like a flag deciding what it wanted to stand for. He said the boy next to him hummed like a kettle and did not stop. Maris didn't correct him. Some details you leave alone, some you write down. That night, she sat at her apartment table and wrote a letter with a fountain pen the librarian had insisted she borrow. She addressed it to a P.O. box Lila had created for a project with a name that made its own weather, Fireseed Restored. For whoever is still reading, we have a parachute and a paper that put 2 lives back where they belong. If you find something in a pantry or a barn or a guilt, bring it to us. We'll read it out loud. We'll say the names. We'll ask the county to sit down. We'll fix what we can and remember what we can't. Maris June Holden. She sealed it because some old habits agree with new hopes.
On the anniversary, just before sunset stained the sycamores the color of old bone, Maris and June walked to the white stone. They moved it together,
On one, not three. In the hollow waited only earth, because they had learned what it was to take what you needed and leave the place ready to bless the next person. June rested her palm on the stone, as if to thank it for keeping house. They made a mistake in 44, she said, not unkindly. We're going to keep making repairs until history remembers what decent looks like. Maris nodded. And what deserving feels like. They watched the water pull a double shift and not complain. They listened to birds do their evening bookkeeping. When they spoke the name Elias North together, it sounded like something a river could carry without losing. Maris's phone vibrated with the kind of text that uses punctuation like oxygen. Lila, ABCMR approved. Record changed. Metal cited. See you in D.C.? June read over her shoulder and smiled. Yes, she said simply. You should go. I'll drive. Engines like good work. On the day they stood in a government building that had learned to let light in through reasons, the clerk pronounced Elias North with all the vowels. The citation smelled faintly of new paper, being told it could start healing. June held the bronze star like a person who had given a lifetime to an afternoon. Lila took a photo that, for once, didn't leave anyone out. After, they ate pie at a diner that had heard all the stories and tried not to brag about it. June tapped her fork against her plate like a gavel. Case closed, she said. Case open, Lila corrected. See the map on my kitchen wall. Maris lifted her coffee and looked at the reflection of 3 women in its surface. One old as good bread, one middle as a fight that doesn't apologize, one young enough to decide what the word restoration could mean if you let it be a verb for people. To seeds, she said. They touched cups the way you touch a doorframe when you leave a house you want to come back to. Back home, on a Sunday that smelled like mown grass and brake cleaner, Maris climbed a ladder and bolted a new sign above the shop door. The old one had done its work. The new one kept the promise her father's hands had made when they set a dog tag in her palm. Halden Restorations. Under it, smaller. Engines, artifacts, names. She stood in the lot and read it until the letters stopped looking like work and started looking like invitation. The first customer under the new sign was a man carrying a shoebox that didn't ask permission to feel heavy. He set it on the counter and cleared his throat. Found it in my mother's attic, he said. Figured you'd know whether it wants to be a machine again or a story. Maris smiled, the way a person smiles when a map drawn in pencil turns out to be right. Around here, we let it be both. She reached for the box with careful hands that had learned the difference and the kinship between torque and tenderness.